They laughed when I stood at the altar beside her, their voices echoing through the dusty air like the clang of cowbells in a storm. Dustvale had always been a place of hard men and harsher women, but nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for Clara. Clara, the giant widow, the mountain of muscle wrapped in mourning silk, the towering figure that made even the sheriff lower his hat and step aside. They told stories about her, you know. They said she'd snapped her first husband's neck with a single hug. Said the second vanished after their honeymoon, last seen limping toward the canyon like he was escaping death itself. The third? Well, nobody even remembered his name. Just that a coffin was closed tighter than the vault at Miss Jenny's gambling parlor and no one was allowed to peek inside. So yes, they laughed when the cards turned against me at the cursed poker table, and Mayor Thompson, half drunk and meaner than a rattler, slammed down the final hand and barked, "Eli Turner, by the laws of this town," and the wager agreed, "You're now the betrothed of Miss Clara Hensley?" The saloon erupted. Beer sprayed. Chairs fell over. Even Miss Jenny herself couldn't stop the giggle that slipped out before she covered her face. And me? I just sat there, pale, frozen, mouth open like a fish pulled from the river and dropped into a frying pan. That's when the doors creaked open. Dust swirled through the saloon. Silence dropped like a hammer. There she was. Clara. Her boots thudded against the wood like war drums, every step deliberate, powerful. Her frame filled the doorway. Arms like steel cables, shoulders wider than most men's dreams, and those cold, glacial blue eyes that locked onto me with something unreadable. She didn't say a word. Just stepped forward, reached out, and grabbed my wrist gently yet firmly enough that I knew there'd be no refusal. She didn't drag me. She didn't need to. I followed like a lamb because somehow, some strange corner of my soul knew it was already decided. In the days that followed, the town watched me like a circus act. I'd walk down the street and feel the eyes boring into my back. They whispered. They pointed. Children giggled behind their mothers' skirts. And through it all, Clara said nothing. She didn't smile. Didn't scowl. She simply worked lifting hay bales like feathers, repairing fences, chopping wood with swings that could split a stump in a single blow. I stayed at her home. Not because I wanted to, but because Mayor Thompson insisted the engagement be honored properly until the preacher returned from his trip. A promise made is a promise kept, he told me with a smirk. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Nights were filled with the creak of the windmill outside and the occasional shuffle of Clara's heavy footsteps on the wooden floor. She cooked. I cleaned. She worked. I taught my lessons at the schoolhouse and avoided eye contact with the children who now saw me as a dead man walking. But then, things shifted. Slowly. It started with a meal. I complimented her stew. It was thick, hearty, warm. "Thank you," she muttered. That was the first word I'd heard from her in 4 days. The next morning, she left a cup of coffee for me on the table before heading out to the barn. The next week, she asked me about my books. Said she never learned to read well. I offered to teach her. She listened. Listened like nobody ever had. Not the way children have cared about lessons, but with a hunger in her eyes, like words were a key to something long locked away. On the eve of our wedding, I found her sitting under the oak tree, holding a photo of Amana, her third husband, I assumed. Her hands, so massive and calloused, trembled slightly. I didn't speak. Just sat beside her. She said softly, "He was kind. But scared. Always scared." Never looked me in the eye. I nodded. She looked at me, truly looked at me for the first time. "You're scared too," she said. "But you stay." I didn't have an answer. Didn't know if I was brave or just too dumb to run. But I stayed. And she didn't seem to need more than that. The next morning, the church bell rang through town. Dust swirled again. The crowd gathered, eager for a spectacle. The bride was a towering force in white, the dress custom-made and laced tight around muscles that rippled beneath the fabric. The veil sat atop her head like a crown of soft rebellion. She looked like a warrior forced into softness. I stood there, buttoning my best shirt though it still looked like a potato sack next to her gown. When I walked out, the crowd parted, laughter bubbling from every corner. "Look at him," someone snorted. "Poor bastard, don't stand a chance. Blink twice if you need rescuing," another yelled. But I didn't flinch. Claire approached. Step by step. Her shadow fell over me. Her face was unreadable. The preacher, wide-eyed and barely tall enough to see over the podium, gulped audibly. "Do you a broken bar or a broken bar take Eli Turner to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Silence. A long beat. Then, "I do." Her voice was a storm cloud. Deep, thunderous, but steady. All eyes turned to me. My throat dried up like the canyon. "A broken bar I do." My voice cracked. They laughed again. I felt heat rise to my ears. But Claire didn't laugh. She didn't blink. She just took my hand, big enough to crush mine, and squeezed gently. Something in her touch told me something no one else in that crowd ever did, that I was safe. That I was seen. The crowd didn't get it. Not yet. They still thought this was a joke. A freak show. That I'd end up in a shallow grave or running for the hills. But I looked up at her, past the biceps, past the mountain of intimidation, and saw a woman. A woman who had lost more than most could understand. A woman who had been feared, shunned, ridiculed. A woman who had been strong for so long that she'd forgotten how to be anything else. And somehow, I wasn't afraid anymore. Somehow, I knew this was where I was meant to be. The preacher declared us man and wife. And as we walked down the steps of the church, hand in hand, with laughter and whispers still following us like ghosts, I felt something shift deep inside my chest. A quiet promise. Not to survive her, but to understand her. To see her. And to stay. The morning after the wedding, the sunlight spilled into our room like honey over old wood, warm and quiet, and for the first time since I arrived in Dustvale, I didn't wake up afraid. I didn't jolt from some nightmare of Clara crushing my ribs or dragging me into the woods or whispering my name like a ghost. Instead I woke up to the sound of a pan clinking against the stove, the smell of coffee and eggs in the air, and the softest hum I'd ever heard rising from Clara's chest like some secret she hadn't meant to share. I just lay there on the edge of the bed, watching her back as she moved, shoulders that had carried grief for years now relaxed, just a little, and I realized something terrifying and beautiful as she was trying, really trying, not just tolerating me but maybe even hoping for something real, and in that moment, I knew I had to stop seeing her as some punishment or forced burden and start seeing her for what she was, a woman who had been written off by everyone else. A woman who had lost more than 3 husbands. She had lost the right to softness, to companionship, to being held without suspicion. The town had turned her into a monster long before I showed up, and yet here she was, offering me breakfast with trembling hope hiding beneath those enormous arms. So I got up, walked over, and without thinking, I reached for the pan to help. She looked down at me, surprised, maybe even startled, and I smiled up at her like we'd been married a decade, and said, "My turn to flip the eggs," and her lips twitched a not quite a smile, but something close, and from that morning onward, things began to shift, not fast, not like in stories where one kiss changes everything, but slow and clumsy and real. Every day I taught at the schoolhouse, I came home to find she'd fixed something new. I patched the roof, mended the fence, carved a bookshelf out of old crates from my novels. She'd never say anything, never boast or even mention it, but she watched my face for a reaction, waiting for that nod, that quiet appreciation, and I gave it, every time, sometimes with words, sometimes with just a hand on her arm, which she pretended not to feel but always lingered near afterward, and she started coming to my lessons too, not during school hours, but in the evenings, sitting on the floor cross-legged while I read aloud, sounding out syllables, tracing words with her huge fingers like she could wrestle the meaning from them, and I'd correct her gently, her brow furrowed, but she never gave up, never stormed out, just kept trying, and one night she read a whole sentence from Tom Sawyer without a single pause, looked up at me like a child seeking approval, and I swear I saw tears shimmer behind those ice-blue eyes, but she blinked them away fast, turned to the stove and pretended she was just hungry, and I let her have that dignity, and slowly, the walls between us fell, not with a crash, but like snow melting in spring, little drops at a time, and we started laughing more. She told me stories about her childhood on the mountain, how she carried calves on her shoulders before she was 10, how she once knocked out a bear with a skillet. I didn't even know if half of it was true, but her voice got warmer with each tale, and I told her about my parents, gone in a fire when I was 15, about how I loved books because they were the only thing that never burned, and she listened, truly listened, and one night, as the wind howled outside and the fire cracked loud between us, I reached for her hand without thinking, just reached for it like it was the most natural thing in the world, and to my surprise, she didn't pull away, didn't stiffen. She let her fingers strong enough to crush bony wrap gently around mine, like I was made of glass, and in that moment, I realized she wasn't the monster they all claimed she was. She wasn't dangerous or cursed or doomed, she was just tired of being alone, and I was tired too, tired of fear, of smallness, of running from anything that felt bigger than me, so I stayed, day after day, night after night, and soon, the town began to notice. No longer was I the walking dead, no longer was I Eli the poor fellow who got caught, now they watched me curiously, confused, even annoyed, like they had bet on the wrong outcome. Some avoided me, others whispered louder, but none of them mattered anymore, not really, because I had found something real with Clara, something unshakable. And it wasn't until the raiders came that Dustvale truly understood what they'd mocked. They rode in fast and loud, a dozen men on horses, guns drawn, masks covering their sneers. They thought Dustvale would be easy pickings, too small to resist, too proud to surrender, but they hadn't counted on her, hadn't counted on Clara, the widow, the monster bride, stepping out into the street like she'd been waiting for this moment all her life. Wearing no armor, no weapon, just her sheer size and presence, and beside her, I stood too. Trembling at first, but unwilling to run, because this was our home now, and I wouldn't leave her, not now, not ever. The lead raider barked something crude, something about women knowing their place, and Clara took a single step forward, and I swear to the stars above, the earth itself seemed to flinch. The man laughed, raised his pistola, and she was on him before he even cocked the hammer. Her fist hit his chest like a sledgehammer, sent him flying off the horse and into the mud. The others hesitated, confused, firing wild shots that hit fences, windows, but not her, never her. She moved like a force of nature, not just strong, but smart, dodging, moving, disabling without killing, though she could have, God knows she could have, and I helped too, not with fists, but with fire. I ran to the schoolhouse, lit the emergency flare, signaled the next town for help, secured the children who were hiding inside, and when it was over, when the smoke cleared and the outlaws were tied and groaning, Clara stood in the middle of the road, blood on her dress, none of it hers, chest heaving, hair wild, and the town stared, not laughing, not whispering, but stunned, and then someone clapped, slowly, awkwardly, then another, and another, until the whole of Dustvale was cheering, and not for me, not for survival but for her, and in that moment, something shifted forever. No one dared mock her again, no one whispered "giant widow" with a sneer, because she had saved them, all of them, and me. I walked up to her, took her hand, lifted it high like a champion's, and kissed her knuckles, and for the first time in public, she smiled abroad, unapologetic, radiant, and the town finally saw what I had seen weeks ago, a woman worth loving, a woman worth following, a woman who had more heart than any 10 men combined, and in the years that followed, she never had to walk through town alone again, never had to bow her head or bite her tongue, because I was by her side, not as her shield, but as her partner, her equal in love, if not in size, and together we rebuilt Dustvale, turned the schoolhouse into a center of learning for adults too, taught men to read, women to lead, Clara herself becoming a town leader, not by election, but by sheer respect, and when children passed us on the street, they didn't laugh, they waved, some even ran up to hug her leg, and every time she'd lift them high into the sky, their giggles ringing out like bells, and I'd watch, heart full, knowing Thiza was the life no one expected, the ending they never saw coming, and yet, it was real, it was ours, forged in fire, sealed in silence, and blooming every day with laughter and love, and as I lay beside her at night, my head resting against her chest, feeling the steady thump of her impossible heart, I knew without doubt that what they had once called a curse had become my greatest blessing, because I wasn't just the man who married the giant widow, I was the man who stayed, and in doing so, I'd found the only thing worth fighting for in a town full of cowards, a woman who had been unloved for far too long and who now, at last, was truly seen.